President Trump set to hold a roundtable meeting on prison reform any moment now. We will take you there live. It is one of the few occasions we will hear from the president as he spends the week in New Jersey. Will he comment on a potential meeting with the special counsel, Bob Mueller? When the president speaks, we will bring it to you live. Stay with us on that. But first, good afternoon. Iran is telling North Korea to go slow on trusting the U.S. If North Korea is listening, should we be trusting them? Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Maria Bartiromo, in today for Neil Cavuto. This is your world. And as new U.S. sanctions kick in, Iran's president is ripping the U.S. in a meeting with North Korea's top diplomat. Is the goal to get Kim Jong-un to back out of a nuclear deal with President Trump? We've got full Fox team coverage today. Blake Burn on how the Trump administration is responding to the meeting, and Ashley Webster on why, when it comes to Iran's oil, the U.S. may already be winning. We begin with Blake.
Hi there, Maria. And as you know, the Trump administration is trying to carve out a deal as it relates to denuclearization of the Korean peninsula with North Korea. And as that is happening, Iran is warning North Korea that the United States, in their words, cannot be trusted. The Iranian leader Hassan Rouhani meeting earlier this week with a top diplomat from North Korea. And this was how that meeting was relayed as it comes from Iranian state media. One quote, quoting Hassan Rouhani, quote, "The U.S. administration performance in these years has led the country to be considered untrustworthy and unreliable around the world, which does not meet any of its obligations." It comes, of course, as the Trump administration has levied new sanctions against Iran and says more sanctions will be coming in about 90 days from now on November 4th. And as the administration says, it is open to meeting with Iranian leadership. Here was the National Security Advisor John Bolton earlier this week.
They could take up the president's offer to negotiate with them, to give up their ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs fully and really verifiably. If Iran were really serious, they'd come to the table. We'll find out whether they are or not.
Rouhani, who is now, as we know, meeting with the North Koreans, Maria, though, he has been deeply skeptical in the recent days of any sort of meeting taking place between Iran and the United States. Maria.
All right, Blake, thank you. One of Iran's biggest oil customers reportedly buying more U.S. crude as U.S. sanctions kick in. Fox Business Network's Ashley Webster with more on that angle. Ashley.
Yeah, and Maria, this could really bite us with regards to Iran's financial situation. India Oil says it is now buying more U.S. oil than it would Iranian oil. That's an important development, and they're doing this because those sanctions that the U.S. are going to put in place loom large. They're going to begin November the 5th. Indian oil exports 6.6 million barrels last year. We'll take a look at the oil chart right there. Oil is kind of drifting sideways right now as this all plays out. But look at the Indian oil imports from 2017, 6.6 million brought in from the U.S. This year, up to 16 million barrels while it cuts back on Iranian oil. Now, let's talk about Iran's oil production. It's OPEC's third largest producer, 3.8 million barrels per day. It's probably closer to 2 million barrels right now. But 50% of that production goes to China and India. So if India's cutting back on its Iranian oil, that hurts. More than 60% of all of the revenue from exports comes from oil. And that, by the way, as we know, is really starting to pinch the Iranian economy. I want you to take a look at this headline that was in the Daily Express in the UK this week. It said Iran revolution is coming as 100,000 rush to the streets chanting death to dictator. Why is this happening? Well, as these sanctions kick in, high levels of unemployment, collapsing currency, even water shortages are really getting the Iranian people upset. We're seeing them also now turning from economics to politics. They're also protesting the regime's views on women's rights, freedom of speech, basic freedoms. And Maria, we're also getting reports now out of Iran that wealthier Iranians are starting to stockpiling basic commodities because they fear the economy is only going one way in Iran. Iran, for its part, says, oh, ignore Donald Trump and his administration. No one can stop us from taking our oil. But as we know, the administration by November 5th says it wants zero Iranian oil being taken in by any country. Otherwise, the U.S. will impose sanctions. India and its decision to take in more U.S. oil shows that those sanctions are starting to have an impact.
Tough situation there, Ashley.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Ashley Webster.
Sure.
So does Iran have good reason to be nervous? Are the president's policies the reason? Former USS Cole commander Kirk Lippold joins me right now. Good to see you, Commander. Thanks for joining us. Your reaction to what's taking place in Iran right now?
Well, good afternoon, Maria. And I think what you're seeing is that the United States, when we pulled out of the agreement and said we're going to impose sanctions, in fact told the Iranians that agreement was bad. We are not going to allow you to be the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and you need to come back to the table. That agreement was a pathway to a bomb in 10 to 15 years. People realize that, and now we're at a point where let's come back, let's talk, and let's have a deal that is verifiable, that is quantifiable, and that prevents them from getting that pathway to a bomb.
How worrying is it that North Korea is siding and teaming up with Iran to go against the United States?
I'm not particularly worried about it. I mean, let's be realistic, Maria. Neither Iran nor North Korea trusted us to begin with.
Right.
When it comes to nuclear weapons, it has to be a verifiable regime that all countries involved have to do it. If North Korea and Iran are talking to each other, if there's one thing North Korea is going to take away from this, is that when it comes to denuclearization, the United States is going to play hardball. We are going to have a verifiable set of steps to denuclearize. And right now, the North Koreans are not taking the steps necessary. They're going to have to come up to the table, sit down, and start with the progress to do it, or the United States is continue to keep those sanctions in place with North Korea and continue to put the squeeze on the Iranian economy as well.
So lay out the next couple of months for us. What does this look like? Are you expecting Iran to come back to the negotiating table to try to keep the United States in a nuclear deal?
No, Iran won't come back to the negotiating table right now because in their eyes, to do that would mean that they recognize that it was a bad deal. The United States pulling out was, in fact, the right thing to do. They view it as a saving face method. So the Iranians are going to take several months doing nothing before they would begin to create the conditions by which, in a face-saving measure, they could come back to the negotiating table and renegotiate that treaty with economic sanctions being relieved. By the same token, the North Koreans are going to be observing this. They know that the United States is going to continue to demand that they denuclearize. When you look also at a second thing that's kind of the shadow over all of this, is look at the pressure that we're putting on China economically with the tariffs. That is playing into this as well, because China is the backer for North Korea's nuclear program. They've aided and abetted it for years, and now it's time for that price to be paid as well.
North Korea is denouncing the United States for what it's calling, quote, outdated acting script. But you think the president's policies are working?
Clearly they are working. The Iranian regime is going to put up with a lot of economic squeeze. They know that their people are going to be upset with it. They know that they're state sponsor of terrorism throughout the region. They're backing up the Houthi rebels in Yemen. All these things, as well as Syria, are feeding into the Iranian people saying, wait a minute, you're spending money everywhere but here at home. The conditions at home are becoming intolerable, and we're going to speak up. So you need to cut back on these other activities and start taking care of everyday Iranians here at home, because we cannot afford and will not live under these conditions. And the Ayatollahs know this.
Yeah, so something's got to give, right, Commander? I mean, when will that happen, and what does that mean?
I think at this point, Maria, you're going to see these conditions continue to exist in Iran for probably the next 4 to 6 months as the rial continues to lose in its value, as the economy continues to spiral down in Iran. Normal people are going to start stepping out into the street. Then Iranian leadership is going to have to sit down and say, where can we cut back on our regional engagements to destabilize that area and begin to bring some of those forces and some of the money home so that they can provide the basic services, whether it's water, sewage, garbage collection. It's the simple stuff that is going to take down that regime, not the complicated, far-flung worldwide stuff.
Right, because the people are watching the leadership use money on weaponry and use money for things other than actually supporting the people.
Absolutely, and they are well aware. They're not in a bubble like North Korea. They do have access to the internet, to the radio, to worldwide communications. So the people in Iran who tend to be very well educated throughout the Middle East are very aware of what is going on with their country, their engagements worldwide, and the fact that they are not being taken care of home, and that the leadership there is the ones responsible for the fact that they can't get the basic services.
All right, Commander Lippold, good to to see you as always. Thanks very much for weighing in here. We will keep watching. We are just a few moments away from the president's roundtable on prison reform. Rick Leventhal is in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, where the president is, and he will be doing that roundtable momentarily. He's got the very latest. Rick.
Well, Maria, I'm watching the feed from the pool camera at the Trump National Golf Club in nearby Bedminster. We're waiting for this meeting to start and for them to allow the pool camera access to that meeting. It's one in a series of meetings that the president has held on prison reform. There was one at the White House back in January, and then another one last week with faith leaders about how to adjust the prison justice system, perhaps reduce the minimum mandatory sentences for some inmates, try to give people a second bite at the apple, as one publication put it. So this is a meeting now today with governors and attorney generals from 7 states that have implemented similar prison reforms in their states. So the governors will be briefing the president on how things are going in their states, and then the president will be discussing the possibilities of reform. There's a bill, the First Step Act, that the president hopes to get passed through Congress that would help implement some of these reforms. So again, this meeting will be happening at the Bedminster Trump National Golf Club. Moments from now, the president meeting with attorney generals and governors from 7 different states, along with advisors and members of his cabinet. And the topic, of course, is prison reform, something that the president has been talking about since January of this year, Maria.
Rick, what does the president want to do in terms of prison reform? I mean, I know that he's talked a lot about the prisons being too crowded and the conditions bad, but what specifically does he want to change?
Well, he also says that he can save taxpayers money, and part of that is in reducing some of these mandatory minimum sentences that some have argued are way out of line. In fact, you may recall back in May, the reality star Kim Kardashian actually had a meeting at the White House with the president because she was appealing on behalf of a woman, Alice Marie Johnson, who was serving a mandatory life sentence in prison. She was a first-time nonviolent offender, was a middleman, if you will, in a drug transaction, and was serving life in prison. So Kim Kardashian went to the White House to try and get the president to pardon her sentence. He did, in fact, give her clemency a week later, and she is now out of prison and back with family members. That's an example of the kinds of things that apparently that the president wants to accomplish, to get people who shouldn't maybe spend the rest of their lives in prison, to get them out of prison, save the taxpayers some money, and give people a second chance.
All right, we will leave it there. Rick Leventhal, thank you.
Sure.
Letter to Director Wray next week and ask him, what is the policy? Why didn't you tell President Trump that you had concerns about Carter Page? Is there a double standard here? If this was a counterintelligence investigation, not a criminal investigation, the FBI should have told President Trump they had concerns about Papadopoulos and Page. Why didn't they do for Trump what they did for Feinstein?
That was South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham on Fox News last night. He wants answers from the FBI on why California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein got a tip about a possible Chinese spy working in her office. By the way, he had been working for her for 20 years. Yet President Trump did not get the same warning about the Carter Page situation and Carter Page possibly being a Russian spy. Attorney Jenna Ellis sees a double standard here. She joins me right now. Jenna, good afternoon. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Maria. Thanks for having me.
It's a head scratcher what went on in the 2016 election. We know that there was real sketchy stuff going on at the top of the FBI and the DOJ. Your thoughts on what should have been done in terms of Carter Page and the wiretapping going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a perception of a double standard, and perception dictates reality for most Americans. I mean, the traditional values that we all cherish, which is the lack of bias, trust, fundamental legitimacy in our law enforcement agents. I mean, that's what matters to every American family. And at the James Dobson Family Institute, where I work, we hear from American families daily with their issues and things that they really want to hear from in terms of just judicial reform with these kinds of issues. And I think that for American families, when they're seeing this type of overt bias, and that the bias depends on whether you are Democrat versus Republican, that's incredibly problematic for the FBI and for law enforcement when their oath of office is to maintain the integrity of the investigation and not whether a D or an R is after your name.
Right.
And so for this type of investigation, administration, there is definitely a double standard that really needs to stop. And I think that just the FBI thought they wouldn't get caught because they thought Hillary was going to win.
Right. But it's not stopping, Jenna. So where is the accountability? Do you think we will ever see accountability? I mean, Devin Nunes, the chairman of the Intel Committee on the House, has been with me several times telling me that there was no evidence whatsoever to launch even an investigation into potential collusion between Donald Trump and the Russians. And so here we are a year and a half later, the special counsel still going on, and we continue to see texts from FBI agents showing this incredible amount of bias. What do you think? Will we see accountability?
I hope so. I mean, and that's something that Senator Graham made very clear yesterday when he was saying that he spoke with President Trump and that he sees that what is going on with the FBI. And I think all Americans, especially leading up to midterms, they want to see that accountability. They want to make sure that there isn't this type of overt bias. And the examples just keep coming. I mean, when we have Hillary Clinton, who's not really being investigated, there's been no prosecution, and there's mountains of evidence for her emails, her server, all of the problems we see, the overt bias between Strzok and Page. Right. And then yet there is not one shred of evidence that any collusion or any sort of crime happened for President Trump's campaign or on behalf of his administration, and yet the Mueller investigation is still going on. Why in the world would President Trump agree to sit down with Mueller? It wouldn't make sense. No competent defense counsel, I've been a defense attorney, no competent counsel would ever advise that, and that's just lending credibility to his assertion that at this point it is a witch hunt. And I think the American people want closure to this, and they want to see justice because that really is a pre-political value. That's a traditional value. That's something that our Constitution actually stands for in terms of due process. We want equal protection under the law. Equal protection should not depend on your political registration and affiliation.
Yeah, well, at this point, we continue to see all of this evidence. And given the fact that the special counsel is looking at collusion or potential collusion, wouldn't he want to look at why the Hillary Clinton campaign paid for the dossier, which was used to wiretap Carter Page?
He should. I mean, and this is. We hope so. I mean, and this is where a special counsel and a prosecutor's higher obligation of ethics should dictate to go wherever the evidence leads, regardless of where that leads. And so the fact that he's so focused on Manafort and that trial has become much more about his involvement and just the very, very quick, tenuous involvement with the Trump campaign, rather than any sort of evidence against Hillary. The fact that Mueller is so focused on Trump rather than going where the evidence leads shows his bias as a prosecutor, and again just undermines the legitimacy of law enforcement, the DOJ, and the FBI. Yeah. So I hope that there is accountability, and the Mueller investigation at this point, if nothing has come out, there's been no evidence whatsoever, it needs to close in terms of investigating Trump, but rather look at where the evidence is leading with Hillary, the dossier, the emails, the servers, all of those things. All of the American people are wondering what's happening there.
Right. Well, you're right. There was not really an investigation into what Hillary Clinton did. We know that at this point. And what's interesting now is this new information that Dianne Feinstein had a driver who ended up being more than a driver, one of her assistants, for 20 years that was a Chinese spy. And the California Republican Devin Nunes points out that Feinstein was briefed amid the concerns that one of her staff members was possibly working as a Chinese spy. And yet the FBI had drastically deviating from standard operations by not giving Donald Trump and the campaign a defensive briefing on the Russia situation.
Yeah, and I think that Senator Graham is wise to ask Christopher Wray what exactly is going on here and what is the DOJ's policy. Because when you have someone from the Democratic Party who clearly is being shown favoritism from the FBI, and then you have a candidate from one of the two major political parties in America not being given the same treatment, then that's where you have the overt bias. And that's what's fundamentally problematic here and really undermines the legitimacy and trust in law enforcement and really, frankly, in the government to all Americans, because we all understand justice, we all understand fairness, and even little children understand what's fair and what's not. And when you have a law enforcement situation that's treating one party differently than the other, that's really problematic. And so the Democrats know that it's there. They're just benefiting from the bias, so they're not willing to call it out at this point.
Of course. Jenna, good to see you. Thanks very much for weighing in. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Maria.
We are in New Jersey, where the president is about to hold a roundtable discussion on prison reform with state leaders. We will take you there live after a short break. But first, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez headed to Hawaii to stump for another Democratic socialist tonight. But as she's pushing for socialism here, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley is looking at Venezuela and exposing the crisis happening there. Back in a minute. The roundtable is just getting started. Let's listen in. The president is meeting on prison reform.
Done a lot of work. They're renovating the White House. It's a long-term project, and they approved it years ago. And I said, well, I guess this would be a good place to be in the meantime. So they're doing a lot of work at the White House. I miss it. I would like to be there, but this is a good way of doing it. We have some very outstanding people with us. And I'll make a few remarks. This is largely about prison reform and other subjects, but largely about prison reform. So I want to thank the governors, Matt Bevin, Phil Bryant, Doug Burgum, Nathan Deal, and John Bell Edwards for being here today. Been friends of mine. We've been, I could say, in wars, but we've been on the same side of the wars. That's always good. I want to thank you also to Attorney General Pam Bondi and Ken Paxton. And Ken just filed a very interesting lawsuit, which I think is going to be very successful. I hope it's going to be successful. I also want to recognize Secretary Rick Perry and Secretary Alex Acosta. Thank you both. Rick, thank you very much. We are doing some great things with healthcare, Alex. And you're doing some wonderful things with energy. I hope that project comes along that we're talking about. It's going to help a lot of people. A lot of jobs are going to be created. So I know you're working on it. I look forward to hearing from each of you about your experiences with prison reform and the lessons that we've learned. I know how, Matt, in particular, you have been working so hard. Phil, you've been working long and hard on it, harder than anyone would know. But I can tell you my administration feels very, very strongly about it. One of the single most important things we're doing is to help former inmates in creating jobs. We're creating so many jobs that former inmates for the first time are really getting a shot at it, because they weren't sought and now they are being sought because our unemployment rate is so low, historically low, 50 years. Now our economy is booming. Businesses are hiring, and recruiting workers that were previously overlooked, they're being hired. It's a great feeling. It's a great thing that we've all accomplished. We've created a lot of jobs in the states, and I guess I've helped you a lot on a national basis. We've created 3.9 million more jobs since Election Day, so almost 4 million jobs, which is unthinkable. If I would have said that during the campaign, only a few of the people around this table would have believed me, but they would have. 3.9 million jobs since Election Day. That's pretty incredible. We've added more than 400,000 manufacturing jobs since the election. Manufacturing employment is now growing faster than at any time that it has in 3 decades, over 30 years. Through the Pledge of America's Workers, launched just last month, almost 5 million Americans will receive enhanced career training and opportunities. And I want to thank Ivanka Trump for having done an incredible job on that. She's really worked hard on it. It's something very important to her. I've really, and I've said it to a lot of people, Jared, I want to thank Jared for what's happening on prison reform, because you've really been leading it, something very close to your heart. And as I've said before, we hire Americans. We want to hire and treat our Americans fairly. For many years, jobs have been taken out of our country. We've lost our businesses. We've lost the hiring abilities that we had. Not anymore. Now those companies are coming back. They're coming roaring back to your state, to your state. They're coming back faster than anyone thought even possible. Our first duty is to our citizens, including those who have taken the wrong path but are seeking redemption and a new beginning. That's people that have been in prison and they come out and they're having a hard time. They're not having such a hard time anymore. We passed the First Step Act through the House, and we're working very hard in the Senate to refine it and pass it into law. We think we'll be successful in that regard. The bill expands vocational educational programs to eligible federal inmates so that more of them can learn a trade. And that's what we're doing. We're teaching them trades. We're teaching them different things that they can put into good use and put into use to get jobs. I recently met with Chairman Grassley and other members of Congress to discuss the bill. We also agreed that we must be tough on crime, especially on criminals and trafficking of drugs and lots of other trafficking. We have a trafficking problem, including human trafficking. We're very, very tough on that, and that's going to remain tough or even tougher. We must strengthen community bonds with law enforcement, including cities like Chicago that have been an absolute and total disaster. We'll be talking about Chicago today because that is something that, in terms of our nation, nobody would believe it could be happening. They had 63 incidents last weekend and 12 deaths. That's bad stuff happening, and probably, I guess you have to take from the leadership. It's called bad leadership. There's no reason in a million years that something like that should be happening in Chicago. We want every child to grow up in a safe neighborhood, surrounded by families that are loving and helpful and with a path to great education and a lifelong career. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I think what we'll do while the media's here, maybe we'll just go around the room real quickly and we'll introduce yourselves. And these are people that have really worked hard on prison reform and lots of other things, but on prison reform. And that's largely what this meeting is about. Governor, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. We are very pleased with what's happened in Georgia. We have seen since I became governor a 10% decrease in violent crime in our state, a 20% overall decrease in crime. We have seen our African American percentage in our prison system drop significantly. Black males has dropped almost 30%.
That's good.
Black females dropped about 38.2%. Our African American commitments to our prison is at the lowest level it has been since 1987. And in states like ours, we have a disproportionate number of minorities in our prison versus our population as a whole. We have found that reentry is a vital part of this. We found that I did a question that I asked. I said, what's the most common characteristic of those in our prisons? The answer was 70% of them never graduated from high school. So we immediately concentrated on that. We have significantly beefed up our GEDs. We've also brought a private charter school into our system to teach them, give them a real high school diploma. We found that if you give them a blue-collar skill, you reduce your recidivism rate by 24%. If you give them just the education of getting a high school diploma, it's reduced by 19%. So we have been very successful. We're pleased about it, and we're pleased to share whatever information we have that might be helpful.
Good. Thank you, Governor. Thank you very much. Pam?
President Pam Bond, the Attorney General of Florida. Thank you for doing this. As a career prosecutor, you see people who go to prison and get out of prison and can't find a job. And how do we expect people to succeed without being able to get a job? And you were just in Tampa. Thank you for that. Tampa Bay Tech, supporting jobs for young people. And that's what's so important is reentry and being able to get a job and training people on how to be successful. And something we did in Florida shortly after I got elected was we decoupled. If you were a convicted felon, you couldn't get an occupational license. So how do we expect you to succeed? So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, John Bell Edwards, and I will tell you in Louisiana, we're proud of the work we've done. It's been sentencing reform, prison reform, and a real focus on reentry. And for the first time in 20 years, I can tell you Louisiana does not have the highest incarceration rate in the nation today. And it's paying dividends for us, and we're reinvesting the savings. Oklahoma.
Really?
Yes, sir. But we are reinvesting the savings into our reentry program and also into victim services. So we're excited about what we're doing. We're looking forward to sharing that with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John Bell. Please.
Mr. President, Doug Burgum, Governor of North Dakota, thank you for coming to North Dakota last month. Great to have you there.
Things are looking good, aren't they?
Things are looking great. Thanks to a lot of policies from this administration and great cabinet that you have. As you know, you can't really separate today prison reform and our prison situation from addiction. In North Dakota, 100% of the women that are incarcerated in our prison system have a disease of addiction. 85% of the men in our prison have disease of addiction. And we can't solve a chronic healthcare problem with punishment. We've got to solve it, treat it like a disease, and solve it that way.
Right.
And so I want to also thank you for the work that your administration is doing on the addiction front, because it ties directly back into this. And I think we've got a number of innovations we'll be happy to share at this roundtable today. Thanks for inviting us. But in the end, we're trying to create better neighbors, not better prisoners. 98.5% of the people that go to prison in North Dakota end up coming back out, and so we have to, when they're there, like the other governors have talked about, it's education, it's career skills, it's treatment. Those are things we have to focus on. If we can do that, we can turn people's lives around and add people to the workforce. We know we need that because we've got so many jobs open in this country.
Thank you very much, Governor.
Ken Paxton, Texas Attorney General. Thank you, Mr. President. This is obviously an important issue to Texas. I think it's an important issue to the nation. And Jared, I appreciate your passion for this issue. 2007, under the leadership of, I think, the greatest governor in my lifetime. He's now Secretary of Energy. Is that right? And the president of our top public policy foundation, Brooke Rollins, we passed legislation similar to what Congress is now looking at, that has had a dramatic impact on our ability to take people from prison into productive lives. And I could cite many statistics, but we were spending $2 billion, and we didn't spend the money. We put $241 million into treatment and to helping people find jobs. We've expanded that since, but it's made a tremendous difference. We have not built any more new prisons since then. We've actually closed 8 prisons. So it's really made a difference, and I think it can make a difference for the nation. So I look forward to continuing the discussion.
How are you doing with your recently filed case? How's that looking?
Well, we had a hearing yesterday, and I think it went quite well. We'll see what the judge says, but we know we're right on the law and we're right on the Constitution, and so we're confident things are going to go in the right way.
It's true.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm Phil Broughton, Mississippi. In 2014, we began our Right on Crime program. We used all the things that Georgia has been successful with. In Texas, I called both of these governors and said, tell me how you did it. I'm a former law enforcement officer. I worked undercover narcotics cases. I've been out there with the worst of the worst. I put a lot of people in jail, and some of it was difficult, particularly when I was state auditor, and over 100 statewide elected officials and government employees went to jail for white-collar crimes. So we began a really strong program working with the Pew Institute of putting that workforce training program into effect, making sure we looked at addiction, mental health. Mental health challenges within the correctional facilities are obviously rampant. Also trying to make prisons a drug-free zone. And a crime-free zone within that prison, so your life can't be threatened every day. You can't be attacked in prison. You can't have access to drugs and be rehabilitated. And then finally, the faith-based organization. It takes a change of heart. Now, I've been around a lot of people who are in jail, and if their hearts aren't changed, their lives will not be changed. So prison ministries, all of those things that government doesn't like to admit to that works. And so when we bring faith back into the prison system, prisoners have hope again. And that worked better for us than anything we could have done. Another reentry program, getting them jobs, getting them the driver's license, keeping them connected with their families so that they have something to work towards when they're getting out of prison. And I can tell you, I had to call a lot of my Republicans into the governor's office and convince them to vote for this bill. They were worried it was soft on crime. They were hesitant about what they were going to tell their people back home. And I said, you tell them to call me. Because crime is down 6%. We have 3,000 less inmates. We saved $40 million since 2014. Right. And you can do the same thing. And Jared, thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Mr. President.
Secretary.
Mr. President, I'd like to make two points. First, as you mentioned, the economy is doing incredibly well. For the first time since we've been keeping records, we have more open jobs than we have people to fill those jobs. And so these reentry programs are needed for the economy. We have jobs ready and waiting for individuals when they leave prison. Second, I'd like to follow up on what so many governors have said. These programs work. As you know and others at the table know, I was U.S. Attorney in Miami. And when you talk with the law enforcement communities, what they will tell you is that these programs foster public safety. When someone leaves prison, the best that can happen for them is for them to find a job. The best that can happen for society is for them to find a job and start contributing to society rather than go back to the old ways of crime. So this is very much a win-win for the individual, for the safety of the community, and for the economy of the nation. And we have individuals that are going from a prison system where the taxpayer is funding the system to contributing members of society that are helping this economic growth. So we're working with various governors. We've put out a request for a proposal. We got so many applications from various governors on programs that are very much outside the box, that this fall we intend to put out another request for proposals to fund another round of reentry efforts. And so I want to thank the governors, and I want to thank all that are working on this issue. It's very important.
Well, you've been great, and your health care plan is going along beautifully. That is really doing something. It's, are you surprised by the numbers you're hearing?
It is. Just this morning I read an article mentioning a number of associations around the country. I believe one in Wisconsin, certainly one in Nevada, that are already forming these. And just today I was talking to some of the governors here about the various activity in their states. And so it's moving very nicely.
It's been great. Thank you, Alex, very much. Rick? Go ahead, Rick.
Well, I would be. Thank you so much, Mr. President. We're so happy to be here. I tell you, I am overwhelmed and so encouraged. These governors are real innovators and they're entrepreneurs, and what they have done is this idea of the laboratories of democracy, that in the states we have moved so many issues forward that now at the federal level, which I'm so honored to become part of your team, but at the federal level we can now see what happened in the states, what's working, what is basically lifting people to a better life, the forgotten men and women of this country. And having lived it in Texas beside these two great men for more than a decade, we've seen firsthand how this changes lives, how it gives people second chances, how it puts communities back together and keep families together. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you for bringing her on board. I think you're seeing on a daily basis what a talent she is dealing with these issues that are really important. Two things that I want to share with the table, with you, and with the general public. And one is it's because of those tax policies, because of those regulatory policies that you push through. We got more people working in America than ever before. And you have to have that. Because if these programs are to work when the folks get out of prison, or if they don't go to prison to begin with, and that's our real goal. And I want to share that these governors around here, every one of them are courageous. Because I heard it when we were doing this back in Texas in the early and mid 2000s, that, you know, well, Perry, we thought you were tough on crime. Nobody ever got me confused with being soft on crime. You know, I signed more execution orders than probably any governor in the history of this country. And that's a sad thing, but it's a fact. So I'm not soft on crime. But I like to say we were smart on crime in Texas, because we put these programs into place, and young people whose lives would be destroyed if we sent them on to prison, and that's where they really become professional criminals. And we never allowed that to happen. We gave them a second chance. And so Texans now really understand it. We shut down 8 prisons, saving some $3+ billion a year in prison costs. And conservatives look at that now and go, that was smart on crime. And Pam, that's what people will say about you, Mr. President, is number one, you've created this climate where people can have a job and have hope for the future. And I'll finish with this, is that you passed that piece of legislation that does clearly reforms the prison system, and I will suggest to you from my perspective that the sentencing reform is part of that as well. And then you have the ability to show this country, and then these laboratories of innovation. You know, when Doug goes back up to North Dakota and he puts in for his state the right programs, and it's not, you know, top down, but you sent the right message that, fellas, here's the way to reform your prison system. We're not going to be in the way. We're not going to be a hurdle for you. And you all figure out how to do it the rest of the way. And this country can be incredibly proud of what they're doing for the next generation of people to come along. And these governors are going to be a real key part of that.
Well, thank you, Rick. Very good. Thank you very much. How's it going energy-wise?
I will tell you, I don't know how it could be much better. The people around the world, we're selling LNG now into 30 countries on 5 continents. John, a lot of that Louisiana gas is headed to a lot of places. Doug, number 2 oil producer in the world, or I should say the United States, only behind the state of Texas.
We're catching you.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And we want you to. Come on, give us your best shot. But things are going good, sir. I mean, it is a massive jobs being created. We got the opportunity to, I don't want to get us off track here, but oil and gas infrastructure. If there's one thing that we collectively, and these governors will tell you that as well, that we'll produce it. Getting it out of this country is the challenge right now.